I am Marie, 29 years old, and the night that was supposed to be the beginning of my happily ever after turned into the kind of nightmare no one ever warns you about. The wedding had been dazzling, a swirl of laughter, music, and champagne, with every guest clinking glasses and whispering about how perfect we looked together. My white dress still shimmered as I sat in the bridal suite, my hands trembling with exhaustion and excitement. He leaned close, his breath brushing my ear as he whispered, "I'll be right back." There was nothing unusual in his tone, calm, confident, almost reassuring. I smiled, foolishly thinking he was going to fetch champagne, or perhaps bring me some surprise he had planned. But minutes turned to hours, and my smile dried into confusion, then hardened into unease. The room was still decorated with roses, candles flickering, the air thick with perfume and the weight of something I couldn't name. I checked the time on my phone. 1 hour, then 2. I tried calling him, but his number went straight to voicemail. Each attempt left me more breathless, my chest tight with panic. My makeup, once pristine, now smudged as I rubbed at my eyes. That was when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, and nothing like the gentle tap of a groom returning to his bride. My pulse thudded against my throat. I staggered to the door, my veil trailing across the floor, my heels clicking like echoes in a tomb. I pulled it open, expecting him, but instead my father stood there. His face was pale, grim, his eyes shadowed with something I had never seen before. In his hands was a worn leather file, bulging with papers. He didn't smile, didn't offer comfort. Instead, he pushed the file toward me and said in a low, fractured voice, "Look, this is who you really married." My fingers froze around the edge of the folder, my heart splitting between dread and denial. My father had always been a man of few words, but there was a tremor in his voice that rattled me deeper than any scream could have. The hallway behind him was silent, empty, like the world itself had stopped breathing. I wanted to shut the door, to pretend none of this was happening, but his eyes, red-rimmed, almost pleading, pinned me in place. Slowly, I pulled the file closer, its weight heavier than gold, heavier than sin. My wedding gown suddenly felt like chains wrapped around me, and the room behind me, with all its roses and candles, now seemed like a cruel stage set for a play I didn't understand. I glanced down at the file, saw names scribbled across the cover, photos tucked into plastic sleeves, and official seals that whispered of secrets long buried. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped it, but I clutched it to my chest like a lifeline. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but my father's hand shot up, silencing me. "Not here," he whispered. "Not where anyone can hear." And then, with a look that chilled me to the bone, he stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it. The sound of that lock turning was louder than any wedding bell, louder than any applause. It was the sound of my life unraveling, thread by thread. The click of the lock echoed like a final verdict, sealing me in a room that moments earlier had been a sanctuary of love, but now felt like a prison cell. My father placed the file on the table with a deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time in my life I realized he was afraid. My father, the man who raised me with stern rules and unshakable authority, the man who had stood unflinching at funerals and boardrooms alike, was trembling. "Marie," he began, his voice heavy with something older than grief, "you need to know the truth before it consumes you." My throat tightened. The gown clung to me like a second skin, suffocating, and I wanted nothing more than to rip it off, to run barefoot into the night. But I stayed rooted, a puppet tangled in strings I couldn't cut. He opened the file, and pages fanned out like a deck of cursed cards. Birth certificates, financial statements, photographs taken in shadows, all of it blurred before my eyes. But then I saw his face. My husband's, smiling, casual, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. My heart stuttered as I flipped to the next page. The same man, different setting, his eyes colder, almost predatory. "This is not the man you think you married," my father said, his voice cracking. My knees buckled and I dropped into the nearest chair, the veil slipping off my head to the floor like shed innocence. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want the answer. He pushed another document toward me, an arrest record. Different name, same face. "He has lived many lives," my father continued. "Each one built on lies, each one leaving someone destroyed." My pulse pounded so loudly, I thought I would faint. I remembered his promises, the tender words, the way he had looked at me during the vows. Every memory now twisted into a grotesque performance. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my chest, strangled by disbelief. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Because he's gone, Marie. He's not coming back. And if you don't act quickly, everything you own, everything you are, will vanish with him." The words sliced through me sharper than any blade. The file's weight dragged at my lap, threatening to pull me under. I turned page after page. Different passports, different women, different cities. A pattern of betrayal woven into every line. My breath came shallow, my vision tunneling, and I wanted to believe this was some elaborate mistake. But the evidence was undeniable. My father's voice softened, almost breaking. "I tried to stop this before it began. I begged you to look deeper, but you were in love, and love blinds the sharpest eyes." His words stung, but beneath them was a desperation I couldn't ignore. The man I thought I loved, the man I thought I knew, was a phantom stitched together by deceit. My wedding night was not the beginning of a fairy tale, it was the opening act of a tragedy I never auditioned for. The walls seemed to close in, the roses wilting in the vase, their scent suddenly cloying, nauseating. My father reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine. "Marie, listen carefully," he whispered. "He is dangerous. He doesn't just leave women broken-hearted. He leaves them ruined, bankrupt, erased. If you want to survive, you must decide tonight whether you will confront him, or disappear before he finds you again." My breath hitched, my body shivering though the room was warm. The choice hung heavy in the air, a noose waiting to tighten. The room seemed to tilt as his words sank in, and for a long moment I could only hear the frantic beat of my heart, like fists pounding against locked doors. My father's warning curled around me like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. "Confront him, or disappear," he had said, but both choices felt like stepping off a cliff into endless darkness. My hands shook as I rifled through more of the file, desperate to prove him wrong, desperate to find a shred of evidence that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But page after page delivered only fresh horror. Bank accounts drained, women who had vanished without trace, families broken by debts and forged signatures. Each document felt like a dagger, carving away the man I thought I knew, leaving behind only a shadow stitched together with lies. My mouth was dry as ash, my thoughts racing in tangled knots. I tried to remember his smile, his laughter, the warmth of his hand in mine at the altar only hours ago, but those memories warped into something sinister. Were his vows ever meant for me, or just another performance in a long string of cons? My father's voice pulled me back from the spiral. "You have to understand, Marie," he said, leaning closer, his eyes raw with urgency. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding night. I came here to save your life." His words struck hard, and for the first time, I noticed the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his hands trembled as if carrying the weight of secrets too long kept. The air between us was thick, heavy with revelations that left no room for denial. My lips parted, trembling. If he's as dangerous as you say, why didn't you stop the wedding? My father's face darkened, a storm crossing his features. Because he threatened you, he whispered. And because sometimes, the only way to catch a monster is to let him think he's already won. The ground shifted beneath me, reality warping until I no longer knew which way was up. I clutched the edges of the chair, my nails digging into the fabric, trying to anchor myself as dread coiled tighter and tighter around my ribs. The laughter and music from the reception below drifted faintly through the walls, grotesque echoes of a world still celebrating while mine disintegrated. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, but fear glued my tongue. My father slid a smaller envelope across the table, his eyes sharp, unwavering. Inside are instructions, he said. A way to protect yourself. But once you open it, there's no going back. I stared at the envelope, its seal intact, as though it contained not just paper but fate itself. My hands hovered above it, trembling, every instinct torn between tearing it open and hurling it into the fire. He'll come back for you, my father warned softly. Not out of love, out of control. He doesn't let go of his marks until they are completely broken. A chill coursed through me, colder than the night outside, colder than the truth unraveling at my feet. My wedding gown felt like a costume, my rings like shackles. I realized then that I wasn't a bride, I was prey. And somewhere in the shadows, the hunter I had married was already watching, waiting for his next move. I reached for the envelope with hesitant fingers, every nerve in my body sparking as if the paper itself pulsed with electricity. My father's eyes tracked the movement, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow, as though he feared what I might find as much as I did. The seal broke with a soft tear, but the sound thundered in my ears like the crack of a gunshot. Inside, folded with meticulous care, were photographs grainy, taken from a distance, the kind of images snapped by someone unwilling to be seen. I held them up, my stomach twisting as I recognized him, my husband standing close with different women in different cities, his arm draped around shoulders, his lips brushing foreheads, his smile always the same rehearsed curve. My chest ached as if a hand had squeezed the air out of me. Beneath the photographs was a single piece of paper, typed words that chilled me to my core. Victim number 17. My name was written beside it. My vision blurred. My breath catching. Victim. I had been reduced to a number in some sinister ledger, my existence catalogued like all the others who had come before me. My father's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. He marks them, Marie. Every woman he ensnares becomes a tally in his game. And you are the next chapter. Tremor raced through me so violently that the photographs slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor like dying birds. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping sharply against the floor, my gown tangling around my legs as though conspiring to hold me captive. This isn't real, I gasped, shaking my head, refusing to accept the grotesque puzzle pieces forming a picture I couldn't bear. But denial crumbled under the weight of evidence. Every page, every image, every whispered word from my father drove the truth deeper, until it carved itself into my bones. I felt suddenly exposed, as if invisible eyes were trained on me from every shadow in the room. My father reached forward, gripping my wrist firmly, anchoring me. Listen to me, he said, his voice fierce, almost desperate. You must leave tonight. Forget the celebrations, forget the gifts, forget the illusions. If you stay, you will not survive. His grip was strong, but his eyes shone with something fragile fear. The kind of fear that belonged not to a man who doubted, but to a man who knew exactly what was coming. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pulled my wrist free, clutching the envelope to my chest as though the damning evidence could somehow shield me. Outside, the faint echo of laughter drifted up again, cruel and mocking, reminding me that only floors away, People were still dancing, oblivious to the storm that had already torn through my world. I wanted to run to them, to scream for help. But who would believe me? Who would believe that the groom they toasted with champagne was a predator who collected women like trophies? My mouth went dry, my body rigid with a paralysis born of fear and disbelief. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. He will return, and when he does, you cannot be here. Choose now, Marie Run, or become another name in his ledger. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming to flee, but my legs felt rooted as if the floor itself had conspired to keep me hostage. In this room of revelations, I thought of the vows we had exchanged only hours earlier, words spoken beneath a chandelier, while friends and family nodded and smiled, unaware that the promises had been part of a cruel theater of deception. My father's plea echoed in my mind: run, or become another name, and yet running felt like admitting defeat, like handing him the final trophy in a game I had never consented to play. I pressed my palms to my temples, trying to force sense into the roaring panic, searching for some logical escape route through the chaos of betrayal. He is dangerous, my father had said, and that truth wrapped around me with the cold inevitability of winter. The reception downstairs continued, muffled music and laughter bleeding through the walls, a grotesque soundtrack to the worst night of my life. I pictured him moving among those celebrations, smiling at guests, the shadow of a predator wearing the face of the man I thought I loved. My mind scoured every detail of our days together, small habits, stories with gaps, the nights he vanished and returned smelling faintly of other places. Moments that once seemed trivial now formed a mosaic of warnings I had been too willing to ignore. I thought of the women in the photographs, their faces blurred by distance but their lives clearly altered by contact with him, and I felt a cold kinship with each of them. My father's hands were on the table, knuckles white, as he watched me wrestle with the unbearable truth. Marie, there is a plan, he said, his voice raw. But it requires secrecy and courage. If anyone suspects, he will disappear, and we will lose our chance. I wanted answers. Who were the women? Who else was involved? And how deep did his web reach? My father gave me names, dates, and a single battered envelope labeled PROOF. I opened it with trembling fingers and found ledgers, receipts, blurred videos, and correspondence that mapped a trail of deceit across cities and years. The USB contained footage that showed him signing false documents, making payments to shell companies, and speaking calmly, while someone on the other end of the call sobbed. My stomach turned. What I held were not merely records but a portrait of a system that used charm to camouflage, cruelty and wealth to silence the injured. My father revealed a cold truth. He had gathered allies, women, and a few men wounded by the same predator who had quietly built their own dossier, waiting for a chance to strike. We would need a lawyer willing to go up against money and influence, journalists with integrity, and the patience to assemble a case that could not be buried. He warned me that exposure would bring its own storm. Smear campaigns, threats, and the possibility that some friends would turn away in fear. Yet beneath his warning lay a flicker of something else, pride, maybe, at seeing me transform from a naive bride into someone capable of demanding justice. I felt a curious mixture of fury and clarity, a trembling resolve that settled into the hard lines of my jaw, like armor forming overnight. If I chose to fight, I would have to shed the illusions that kept me docile and learn the rules of a world where power bought silence and deception paid in promises. My father proposed immediate actions. Leave the venue with only trusted people, change my numbers, contact the allies he named, and secure legal counsel before confronting anyone. He would arrange for a safe place, somewhere off the radar, where we could convene and plan without fear of being watched or recorded. The thought of secrecy felt both consoling and suffocating, but I knew that public spectacle at that moment would only feed him and allow him to disappear into the shadows. I asked him about the cost, both financial and emotional, and he told me, bluntly, that the price of inaction would be far greater. We sat speaking in halting whispers, assembling a mosaic of a response so delicate that one wrong move could shatter it all, and yet every piece of the plan stitched itself into something that began to look like hope. My wedding gown felt heavier with each passing minute, a garment that had symbolized union, now marking the moment of my unmooring from a life built on lies. I thought of the friends below, toasting and dancing, and felt simultaneously enraged and sorrowful that their joy existed on the same night. My world was collapsing around me. My father put his hand over mine, surprising me with its warmth, and said, "You are not alone. We will gather the others, and we will make sure this stops." I glanced at the clock, heard the muffled cheers, and steeled myself. This would be a long fight, and the first step would be to choose allies wisely and move under a silence so complete it would stifle even rumor. I breathed and promised myself I would not be invisible anymore. The promise I whispered to myself that night became a brand seared into my very soul, a vow that no matter how dangerous, I would not surrender to fear, and I would not remain another faceless entry in his ledger of destruction. My father urged me to change out of the gown before we left, but I resisted for a moment, clinging to the stubborn thought that this dress, though tainted, symbolized something worth fighting for, a chance at truth, at reclamation. Yet when I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, I saw not a bride but a ghost, draped in silk and lace that mocked the innocence I had lost. With trembling fingers, I shed the dress and slipped into a simple black outfit my father had brought with him, garments chosen not for beauty but for utility, for disappearing into shadows. The change felt like shedding a skin, stepping away from the naive Marie who had believed in fairy tales. We packed the documents swiftly into a battered leather bag that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain, a bag my father had carried through decades of secrets. Every zipper closed felt like a coffin lid sealing away the life I once knew. He guided me to a side door of the hotel, bypassing corridors where laughter and champagne spilled into the air. I heard the muffled chorus of guests calling my name, perhaps wondering where the bride had gone, but their voices sounded distant, hollow, like echoes from another world. The night air hit me with a sting of cold, sharp and bracing, carrying with it the metallic scent of city streets slick with rain. We slipped into an unmarked car waiting by the curb, its engine idling low. The driver was a woman with sharp eyes, her silence a shield, and though I didn't know her, my father nodded in quiet assurance she was one of the allies. The car pulled away, leaving behind the glowing windows of the reception hall, and I watched them shrink into specks of light, a constellation of false stars fading into nothing. My mind was a storm, every thought clashing with the next, but through the chaos emerged a clarity carved from rage. If he had built his empire on lies, then I would burn those lies to the ground. My father began to outline the network, speaking of others who had suffered, people who had once been silenced by fear or shame, but were now ready to speak. Each name he listed felt like a match, and together they could become a fire no amount of wealth could extinguish. I asked him what made him so certain we could win, and he told me softly, "Because truth has weight, Marie. And once it tips the scale, even giants fall." His conviction wrapped around me like armor, but still, I felt the sting of doubt. What if the truth wasn't enough? What if his power and influence could bend it into something unrecognizable? My father placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "It's the decision to act even while trembling." His words burrowed into me, finding a home alongside the burning ember of my resolve. The city lights blurred past the car window, and I realized that though I was leaving the wedding behind, I was stepping into a union far greater, a marriage between my pain and my strength, one that would birth a relentless pursuit of justice. For the first time since the nightmare began, I inhaled deeply, feeling the oxygen fill my lungs not as air but as fire. The night had stolen my illusions, but in return, it had given me a weapon far more powerful, the unyielding will to fight back. And with that realization, I looked out into the darkness, not as a victim fleeing into obscurity, but as a warrior entering the battlefield of truth. The safe house was nothing like I imagined. Not a cabin tucked into woods or a basement carved beneath some anonymous building, but a modest apartment hidden in plain sight. Its walls painted beige, its windows curtained with thick fabric that blocked any hint of light from escaping. When the car stopped, the driver gave a brief nod before disappearing into the night, leaving my father and me to climb the narrow staircase that creaked with each step as though warning us to tread carefully. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and coffee, an oddly comforting mixture that grounded me after the chaos of the night. My father moved with practiced ease, checking locks, peering through blinds, his posture betraying years of living with vigilance. I sank into a chair at the small wooden table, the leather bag of documents resting heavily in front of me, as if daring me to confront its secrets once again. For a few moments, silence hung between us, heavy and brittle, before I finally broke it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" My voice cracked, the words carrying equal parts anger and grief. My father's shoulders stiffened and he turned slowly, his face lined not just with age but with the burden of choices made long ago. "Because timing matters," he said softly. "If I had told you without proof, you might not have believed me. If I had told you too late, it would have destroyed you completely. Tonight was the only chance to pull you out before the trap closed." His reasoning struck me as both cruel and merciful, a contradiction that left my heart torn between gratitude and resentment. I opened the bag again, pulling out a photograph I hadn't examined closely before. It showed him my husband standing beside a man in a seat, exchanging what looked like documents. My father leaned over my shoulder, his breath warm against my ear. "That man," he said, his voice low, "is a lawyer who launders his money. Together, they've erased identities, silenced witnesses, and turned justice into a commodity." The realization clawed at my insides. I wasn't merely dealing with a liar who broke hearts. I had married into a machine built on corruption, one that thrived on breaking people and burying their remains under paperwork and power. I pressed my palm against the table, grounding myself against the rising tide of despair. My father watched me closely, as though weighing whether I was strong enough to bear the next truth. "He'll come looking for you," he said. "And when he does, you cannot face him unprepared. This fight is not only about you, it's about all of them." His words conjured the faces of those women again, blurred in photographs but now vivid in my imagination. Women who had once laughed, dreamed, and loved, only to be reduced to numbers in his cruel collection. The thought ignited something raw within me, a furious compassion that tore through the fog of shock. "Then we fight," I whispered, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. My father nodded once, approval flickering in his tired eyes. "We begin at dawn," he said. "But for tonight, you must rest. Tomorrow, the war starts." Rest sounded impossible, yet, as I lay on the narrow bed, the shadows pressing close, I realized exhaustion had seeped into every bone. I closed my eyes, but instead of sleep, visions surged: his smile, the file, the photographs, my father's warning. The night was long, but beneath the weight of fear, something else stirred within me. A pulse of defiance, steady and unyielding, promising that dawn would not find me broken but ready to rise. Dawn arrived quietly, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile balance I had wrestled with through the night, yet its pale light slipped through the cracks in the curtains, reminding me that time was no longer mine to waste. I rose with a heaviness that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with the knowledge of what lay ahead, the unraveling of a man who had not only deceived me, but had thrived on destroying others. My father was already awake, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, the table before him covered in papers he had spread out like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. He looked up as I entered, his eyes sharp but softer than they had been the night before. "You'll need clarity," he said, pushing a folder toward me. "These are the accounts, hidden transfers, offshore holdings, names of shell companies, all tied to him. The lines of numbers and coded notes meant little to me at first glance, but their sheer volume spoke louder than any words. This was not one man's deceit, but an empire built on manipulation, lies, and blood. I sank into the chair, running my fingers across the papers, feeling the weight of every victim etched into their cold precision. My father's voice cut into my thoughts. "Marie, he will not go down quietly. If you move against him, you must expect him to strike back with everything he has: money, influence, even violence." His warning was not to scare me, but to prepare me, yet my heart thundered with the question I dared not ask. Was I capable of this fight? My father seemed to read my hesitation, leaning forward, his voice low but firm. "Strength is not something you're born with. It's something you claim when there is no other choice." His words lodged deep within me, stirring the ember of defiance that had sparked the night before into something hotter, more dangerous. I flipped through another file and froze at a page marked with my name. Bank records, surveillance notes, even photographs of me leaving work weeks before our wedding. He had watched me long before I thought I had found him, his interest not born of love but of calculation. My stomach twisted, rage surging like fire through my veins. "He chose me," I whispered, horrified by the truth. My father's face darkened. "He chose you because you were strong enough to be, useful but naive enough to be deceived. That ends now." A silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the ticking clock on the wall, each second hammering home the urgency of our mission. At last, my father pulled out a final envelope and slid it across the table. "This is our plan," he said. "Inside is everything we need to dismantle his empire from the inside: contacts, leverage, allies who've waited too long for justice." My hands trembled as I opened it, scanning the contents, realizing this was no longer about whether I wanted to fight, but how far I was willing to go. The decision crystallized in me, heavy but clear. I would not remain a pawn in his game. I would become the hand that turned the board over. My father watched me, waiting for my response, and I finally met his gaze with steady eyes. "I'm ready," I said, my voice carrying a weight I had never felt before. He nodded slowly, a flicker of pride breaking through his grim expression. "Then today, Marie, you begin to take back what was stolen, not just from you, but from all of them." The words lingered in the air, not as a promise, but as a declaration. The hours that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of planning, each detail more intricate and dangerous than the last, until the safe house itself seemed to pulse with the tension of secrets too heavy for its thin walls to contain. My father and I worked side by side, sifting through the labyrinth of files and cross-referencing names with dates, transactions, and whispered rumors scribbled in the margins. Each connection we uncovered painted a clearer picture of the machine I had unwittingly stepped into, and each revelation carved deeper scars into my already frayed sense of self. By mid-morning, the table was no longer just a table. It was a battlefield where we drew invisible lines against a man whose shadow stretched farther than I had dared imagine. My father tapped one file with his finger, his voice low but edged with urgency. "This woman Elena, she's still alive. She escaped, but she's been in hiding for years. If anyone can confirm the truth and strengthen your resolve, it's her." The name caught in my throat, a fragile promise that I wasn't entirely alone in this nightmare. "Where is she?" I asked, bracing for another blow. His reply was a whisper, as though saying it aloud would summon danger. "She's in the city, working under a new name, watching everything but trusting no one. Reaching her will not be easy. My chest tightened with both dread and determination. The idea of meeting someone who had already walked this path, someone who had suffered and survived, ignited a flicker of hope I hadn't allowed myself before. Yet fear clawed at the edges of that hope. What if Elena refused to see me? Or worse, what if reaching her exposed us both? My father seemed to read my conflict, his hand steady on my shoulder. Trust is fragile, Marie, but it is also the most powerful weapon we have. If you can convince her, she might give us what we need to bring him down. The thought of confronting another survivor, of hearing her truth and weaving it into mine, made the mission feel less like vengeance and more like justice, though I wasn't sure yet if the two could ever be separated. Outside, the city hummed with its usual oblivious rhythm, unaware that inside this hidden apartment, a daughter and her father plotted a war against corruption's beating heart. I packed the envelope carefully into my bag, the weight of it no longer suffocating but purposeful. "When do we leave?" I asked, my voice steady. My father's eyes narrowed with calculation. "Soon. But remember, once you step out that door, there is no turning back. You will not only be hunted, you will be tested." His words settled into me like iron, and I felt the last remnants of doubt dissolve into resolve. As I glanced at the files one final time, the faces of the women stared back at me, silent witnesses demanding, not pity but action. "Then let the test begin," I said, standing taller than I had in days. For the first time, I felt less like a victim and more like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. The cab that took me to Eleanor's neighborhood moved through streets that looked ordinary beneath the morning light, bakeries opening, shopkeepers sweeping, and yet every face seemed a potential threat, as if the city's pulse had been rewritten to the tempo of my fear. My father had given me a name, a bus route, an address that could be a bluff, a lifeline, or a trap. I gripped the leather bag to my chest as if it were armor and rehearsed what I would say, that I was not an enemy, that I needed to talk to someone who had already fought and survived. The driver, a quiet woman with narrow eyes, dropped me 2 blocks away and said only, "Trust your instincts." The words were small, but they landed like a promise. I walked the remaining distance under the weight of 1,000 looks, each one a possible witness, each one a potential leak. The building Elena lived in looked unremarkable. A narrow, 3-story row house with washed paint and a door that bore the faint scar of old knocks. I paused at the threshold, hand trembling, and for a moment I considered turning back, imagining the warmth of the safe house, my father's steady presence, the fragile safety we had created. But something inside me, call it stubbornness, call it a need for truth, pushed me forward. I knocked once, then twice. The door opened a crack, and a pair of eyes peered out, cautious and weary. "Marie?" a voice asked, soft as cloth, and my name felt like a key. "It's me," I said, and the door opened wider. She did not look like the photographs. Those images had frozen her into a distance I could not understand. Up close, Elena was thinner, her hair streaked with grey, and there was a light in her eyes that had survived things meant to extinguish it. We sat across from each other, at a tiny table littered with tea, cups and a single plant that leaned toward the window as if always reaching for more light. She listened as I told her everything. The wedding, the file, the ledger, the way my father had pulled me from the edge of the cliff. Her face remained still, unreadable, and I feared my words would either repel or soften her. When I finished, she placed a hand on mine and did not speak for a long time. Then she breathed, slow and steady, and said, "I believed I was the only one once. Then I met the others. We were fragments, and together we were a force." Her voice carried the weight of years. She revealed small mercies and brutal truths. How she had escaped, who had helped her, the bribes she had refused, and the nights she had spent plotting the tiniest acts of sabotage against the machine that had hunted her. She had recorded names, dates, payments. She had kept copies of ledgers hidden in a false bottom of a battered tin. She told me that my husband had tried to gaslight her when she confronted him years ago. Smooth lies, insinuations that she was unstable, and when she resisted, he had used his network to smear her reputation, to drain her accounts, to make anyone who tried to help her pay the price. But we survived, she said. So can you. Her words were both a map and a challenge. She offered to introduce me to 2 women who had also escaped. Their testimonies would create a pattern too wide to be ignored. As we planned, Elena insisted on one rule: absolute secrecy until we had compiled proof that could not be bought off. She also warned that he would test me, not only with threats but with illusions, gifts, apologies, feigned remorse, tools to re-anchor me to the life he wanted to keep. Do not let your heart be the lever he pulls, she said sharply. Use your fear as fuel, not as chains. The meeting lasted hours, and the more we spoke, the smaller the room seemed to become, filled with the weight of shared history and the brittle hope of justice. As we prepared to leave, Elena pressed a small notebook into my hand. Inside were names and short notes, a map of people who could corroborate my story and provide the turning points we needed to puncture his armor. Then, as I stood to go, a sound soft as the brush of a moth made us both still. A shadow crossed the window pane. A car idled outside in the street. My throat tightened. Eleanor's hand tightened on mine and she mouthed, "Run." Eleanor's eyes flared with a ferocious protectiveness as she pulled a thin shoebox from beneath the table and slid it toward me. Inside, along with the paper list, were 2 forged IDs and a small black key. "If anything goes wrong," she whispered, "this key gets you to a locker where a phone and money wait. Do not hesitate." I tucked the items into my bag, every movement sharp and decisive, and felt the hair on my arms rise as the car outside revved, and then fell silent. 3 knocks sounded on the door, measured, unfamiliar, the kind that belonged to someone who expected compliance. Eleanor's hand tightened over mine. For a moment neither of us moved, calibrating risk against the ground truth that waiting could be fatal. Then she stood, pressing a finger to her lips and guiding me toward the back exit, through a narrow corridor lined with boxes and old coats. We slipped out into an alley that smelled of wet stone and oil. My breath steamed in the cold air, as if visible proof of panic. As we rounded the corner, a car's headlights cut through the dark. A voice called out, casual and too close to be innocent. "Marie?" The sound of my name drifting from that stranger's lips nearly rooted me to the ground. But instinct, or maybe Eleanor's grip on my arm, pulled me forward before hesitation could strangle me. We darted deeper into the alley, our footsteps splashing through shallow puddles, the smell of gasoline and damp brick mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline on my tongue. Behind us, the crunch of boots quickened, followed by the slam of a car door and a voice sharper this time. "Marie, stop." The temptation to turn back, to see if it was him, clawed at me, but I forced my eyes forward, focusing only on the sliver of daylight at the end of the passage. Elena shoved a small packet into my pocket without breaking stride. "If we're separated, you keep running," she hissed, her breath hot against the cold air. "Don't you dare stop, not even for me." The words pierced me, a command wrapped in desperation, and I realized she was prepared to sacrifice herself if it meant the truth survived. My lungs burned, but the sight of the open street ahead fueled me, every step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. We burst onto a busier road where cars honked, people shouted, and life moved on as if unaware of the danger threading itself into the crowd. Elena yanked me toward a bus pulling away from the curb, and with one final surge we leapt aboard, collapsing into seats at the back as the vehicle rumbled forward. My heart thundered, each beat screaming we had escaped, Yet one glance out the window shattered the illusion. The black car followed, keeping pace, its tinted windows reflecting only our fear back at us. Eleanor's jaw tightened, and she whispered, "He knows." The certainty in her tone hollowed me out. I clutched the notebook tighter, my knuckles white, knowing it wasn't just paper, it was a weapon. And now, a target. Around us, passengers spoke in low murmurs, oblivious to the predator trailing us, while I stared at the shifting cityscape, wondering how many steps ahead he already was. For the first time, I understood the full scope of the war one had inherited. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was pursuit, chess played with lives as pawns, and I was one move away from being cornered. My father's warning, Elena's sacrifices, the silent cries of those nameless women all converged inside me, hardening into a resolve that tasted like iron. I would not let him write the ending to my story. The bus turned sharply, the car momentarily blocked by traffic, and Elena seized my hand, her voice low but fierce. "This is your moment, Marie. Decide now, are you prey, or are you the storm?" Her words lit something raw and powerful inside me, and though fear still coiled tight around my chest, I finally answered with a whisper meant only for myself. "I am the storm." The bus lurched to a halt near the central station, brakes screeching, and for a moment I thought fate itself was conspiring to trap me. Elena shoved me forward, her eyes burning with urgency. "This is it, your chance," she said, her voice breaking but steady. We spilled onto the crowded platform, swallowed by the tide of commuters, whose hurried steps and distracted faces created the perfect camouflage. My pulse raced as I clutched the notebook, the packet, and the leather bag, each object no longer just evidence but lifelines tethering me to the truth. The black car circled the block, hunting, but in the chaos of the station, it could not pierce the shield of anonymity. Elena pulled me into a side corridor that smelled of iron and damp stone, where shadows swallowed us whole. She pressed her forehead to mine for a brief, trembling moment. "You have what you need, Marie. If I don't make it out, promise me you'll finish this." My throat tightened, the promise searing itself into my soul. "We finish it together," I whispered fiercely, though deep down I knew her words were not a warning but a prophecy. Sirens wailed in the distance, not for us but for something else entirely, yet they became the soundtrack of my resolve. I watched as Elena disappeared into the crowd in the opposite direction, drawing eyes, baiting danger, her sacrifice deliberate and devastating. Alone now, I clutched the black key she had given me, its weight heavier than any ring I had ever worn, heavier even than the vow I had spoken on my wedding night. Step by step, I moved deeper into the station, my heart a drum of fear and fury, until I reached the locker she had described. Inside, exactly as promised, was a burner phone and a stack of bills, along with a single note in Elena's neat handwriting. "Trust no one but the truth." Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away, dialing the first number from the notebook. A voice answered a woman's voice, steady and scarred, and I knew the network of survivors was real, alive, waiting for someone to connect the broken pieces into something unbreakable. As the train roared overhead, I made my choice. I was no longer the bride abandoned on her wedding night, no longer the naive woman chosen for her silence. I was the storm I had promised to become, and with every victim's story stitched into mine, I would drag his empire into the light. This was not merely revenge, it was justice carved from the ruins of lies. And to those watching my story unfold, to those who had ever felt powerless, abandoned, or betrayed, hear this. The moment you refuse to be prey is the moment your chains shatter. My war has only begun, and I will not stop until every shadow is stripped bare, every wound avenged, every voice restored. So, watch, follow, and stay with me, because this is not just my fight. This is ours. And if you want to see how far I'll go to tear down the man who thought he owned me, Like and subscribe. The storm is here.